climate scientists have named Michigan the best place on earth to live in 2100, which 2100 feels obviously far and away. You and I won't be here, but there's a reason for that, right? That these Great Lakes are really maintaining our climate in a way that's just not happening on any of the coastal fronts or the deep south. So even though it will get warmer or winters get harsher, it just won't quite be, the natural disaster level that we're already kind of seeing across the world.
Welcome to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association, providing benefits and services to real estate investors and rental property owners for over 48 years. With your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group.
This episode is sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com. And RCB and Associates, helping real estate investors and small business owners navigate the complex world of health insurance and Medicare benefits at rcbassociatesllc.com. Hello and welcome to episode 372. Today, we're going to discuss one of the greatest threats, not only to real estate investors, but to everyone who lives in areas with rising sea levels, frequent hurricanes, forest fires, droughts, and intense heat. Yes, I'm talking about climate change. Whether you believe it's real or not doesn't really matter at this point because it's already affecting every single person who lives in this country. But from a real estate investing perspective, there are areas that will actually benefit from climate change, areas that have plenty of fresh water and are somewhat climate resistant, areas like Michigan. My guest today is Lindsay Moore, an economic reporter for MLive, who covers the housing markets across Michigan. Lindsay and her colleague, Sheri McWhirter, have been writing an excellent series on the effect climate migration will have on Michigan and whether or not we are ready for the influx of new residents that we will be experiencing over the coming decades. Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Why don't you tell us, why did you start this series in the first place? What led you to write about climate migrants coming to Michigan?
So as you mentioned in the intro, my area of expertise in our statewide team is the economy and even specifically housing market. And so I was really noticing, just how tight things were with how many people that we have here in Michigan in terms of housing supply. And then on the other end of things, Sheri and I were having just kind of, these side conversations of what does this mean about green space? What does this mean about all of our land that we have here? And we really got to talking to that as more people come to Michigan, as Michigan becomes more, kind of, I don't want to say that I don't want to oversell us too much, but as Michigan becomes more desirable throughout climate change, that this will just kind of increase. That we're going to have tighter housing supply and then also eating up this green space. And also prices are going to go up and it's going to really become, more and more the wealthy can afford to move here. And so Sheri and I were having all these conversations about this. And we said, well, this is a project then. This is something to really dive into because climate change can feel so overwhelming, so nebulous at times because, depending on where you live in the country, it has a totally different effect in your life. Or right now, maybe it doesn't feel like it has an effect quite yet. And so we really got into this concept that, scientists have dubbed us a climate haven, where we're not going to see those really extreme effects that other places with drought, hurricanes, et cetera, do feel. And so we really dove into that idea that people will come here for that. People are already coming here for that kind of, quote unquote, oasis that we have with the Great Lakes. And in turn, what does that mean for all of us folks that are already here in Michigan, that already have property here, own houses here, or want to? What does that mean for us too?
Take us around the country here, because you did a great job of talking to actual people who have come from other states for various reasons. What are some of the experiences they are having in those states that are most heavily affected by climate change and bringing them to Michigan?
I mean, we knew going into this project that was kind of task number one, right? Find the real people that really did move here for climate reasons. And the most obvious example were folks that we talked to that had moved from Oregon. 2020 really had one of the most devastating wildfire years for them. And so I talked with a family that had already had ties to Ann Arbor, but then when smoke was just kind of absolutely surrounding their house throughout September 2020 and the evacuation, grid was getting closer and closer to where they were, they really felt pinched to go somewhere, anywhere. And they said, well, why don't we go to Michigan, right? We already have family ties there. We know that we can do all the outdoor rec stuff we love there. It's also the age of, remote learning, so their kids could come over. And so they spent a couple of weeks in Ann Arbor and they really said, wow, why don't we just move back here? What are we doing? We have summer after summer of smoke and fire, and none of that's happening here in Ann Arbor. And similarly, across the state, I talked to a couple that had also moved from the Portland, Oregon area who were grape farmers. And so their livelihood was depending on, climate change in a different way. And the smoke was ruining crops. It was straining their livestock. And so they came over to the Leelanau County area. And they, were like, wow, look at all this space we have, how beautiful it is. Again, it's not this immediate threat that we were feeling in Portland area. So that was, kind of these really direct knocking at your door impacts of climate change that really moved people. And some of the more surprising examples of folks I talked to were from Washington, D.C., right? And this couple was just tired of the smogginess, of the congestion, just of city living, really, in a lot of ways. And they moved all the way to the UP. They said, you know what? We looked on a map for where we could have affordable land and where that land won't get destroyed. Where's an investment long term? And they were choosing between Michigan and Washington State. And they said, I don't want to risk Washington State losing a property investment. Let's do the UP. Let's be surrounded by water and wilderness. And so now they're happily up in the Keweenaw Peninsula.
One of the things that Michigan has that a lot of other states don't have is the water. Can you put it in context for us? Like, just how much fresh water does Michigan have? And what are some of the people you've talked to who are coming from the drought-stricken states and the experiences that are bringing them to Michigan?
As a Michigander, we kind of take for granted this Great Lakes region that we're in. And, it's not only here in North America are we also dependent on the Great Lakes, but if you really zoom out on a global level, the Great Lakes are about 21% of fresh water on the whole globe. And so I put this in perspective in one of our stories is, if you think of other valuable commodities, let's take crude oil, right? Something that we have become very dependent on. That same percentage, 21%, is the amount that Saudi Arabia has of crude oil. That's what we have in fresh water. And what climate scientists are really kind of pointing to, especially in these coming decades, especially like 2050, even like near future, that, that is going to be just as valuable, if not more, and that people are going to move for water because it will become that scarce. And so that's something that people already had on their minds. You mentioned drought, right? We had this incredible map from our data scientist, Scott Levin, on our team that showed droughts already happening, right? So much of this project is future predictions, but we looked at droughts even in the last 5 to 10 years. And literally, Michigan is gleaming blue when you look at this drought map in terms of all of the orange and red that's happened throughout the west and southwest of the country, and just how much our Great Lakes really do sustain that for us, that we have that incredible green space all across the state, that we have winters, that we have, an entirely different ecosystem. Really, they protect us in a lot of ways. And I talked to folks that were just in St. Louis, so not the deep south even, but even they were getting tired of the way that the heat index was rising on them. And they moved to Michigan for that reason, because they literally drew a 6-mile radius of where can we get close to water. And they ended up in the UP as well, because that was, one of their key goals in house finding on Zillow. They said, where can I make sure that I'm touching water within 6 miles? And I thought that was really interesting as someone that, like I said, kind of took for granted being next to a lake all the time.
When you look at Michigan, and I know that there are projections that talk about climate in Michigan over the coming decades, all the way through 2050 and probably beyond. What is the outlook for Michigan? I think one of the things that I found shocking was that by 2050, we'll have a climate very much like Georgia right now. What are some of the other things that you were surprised to discover?
I think weather, especially being a Michigander, right? We talk about weather constantly. So talking about those rising heat indexes was something that was surprising. Like you mentioned, the Georgia, Tennessee, that's kind of what we're going to feel here in Michigan by 2050. Similarly, though, again, like back to our drought conversation, Michigan will fare better in that respect. We're by no means going to be immune from climate change, but our winters will potentially get harsher. Our summers will obviously get warmer, just like everyone else. But when you see, especially the temperature index kind of rising up, the UP especially really stays the same for quite a long while. But in general, our lifestyles won't dramatically change in the way that other parts of the country will, which is what led us to, this really, kind of incredible stance that climate scientists have named Michigan the best place on earth to live in 2100, which 2100 feels obviously far and away. You and I won't be here, but there's a reason for that, right? That these Great Lakes are really maintaining our climate in a way that's just not happening on any of the coastal fronts or the deep south. So even though it will get warmer or winters get harsher, it just won't quite be, the natural disaster level that we're already kind of seeing across the world.
Let's talk about climate migrants. I want to make sure that our listeners know what we're talking about when we say climate migrants. Can you explain it to them, what that means and what that means to Michigan?
So this term climate migrant is really someone like the folks that I've been describing, that's someone that's moving here for climate reasons. I don't want this to get necessarily confused or mixed in with refugees, people that have to move due to extreme circumstance, people that need to be evacuated. These are people that are moving by choice. And within that is already some socioeconomic privilege that you can move by choice, right? And that you can do it preventatively. But we're already seeing some of that. And I'll be very honest with you, Brian, that was the hardest part of the project, is to prove that migration, because you don't really see it in census data quite yet, because Michigan's population wise isn't growing as fast as other states. And that's kind of been the marker on this for a little bit. But actually, it was exciting. Just 2022 census data, early estimates are showing that migration is happening, that we had, I think the exact data was 10,500 net people coming into the state rather than leaving the state. So our population declines that you see, year over year are, death and birth rates. But people are actually moving into the state, which has not been the narrative for a long time. So that's what it means for Michigan, is that as these folks leave, again, the Southwest or the Deep South, and they come more and more inward towards the Great Lakes region, that Michigan in particular is going to be welcoming quite a bit of them.
Are there projections going forward as to how many people we can expect to be moving into the state?
This is the sticky piece of data. This is the hardest part of the project, because these really are predictions right now, projections, I should say. And so we talked to, scientists that even said, like, oh, well, this is unpublished data, right? Like I'm still in the process of peer review. But I mean, from what the estimates we can nail down, it was tens of thousands just based alone on water rising. So those would be areas, people moving due to floods, right? So that didn't even account for people moving because of droughts and fire. So honestly, the estimate we heard was in the millions. So again, this is such a huge conceptual thing for listeners to wrap their head around, about millions of people coming here. But it is going to be over decades and decades of time. And that's why these estimates are kind of so broad and so big at this point. But yeah, I mean, it could be anywhere from tens of thousands to millions, which I know I'm giving you quite the range, which is also very hard to plan for, which we really got into in the infrastructure and housing piece of this project.
Is there a sense of like, well, in the next couple years, you'll start to see a trickle, in 5 years more, but then within 20 years? I mean, is there any metrics there as to like how soon we can see some of this begin to happen?
I mean, you use the word trickle, which is exactly kind of how we describe it too, is that it's going to be this slow influx. Honestly, I feel like what it's going to be is, like I said, when climate change starts knocking on people's door, when you start to be within that evacuation zone. And so unfortunately, some of it is going to be reactive rather than proactive. And so we don't have a firm sense. My answer is no. I couldn't tell you 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now what the numbers will be. Honestly, that early 2022 census data is the closest that we have to really show that migration, that 10,000 plus people moving inward and moving internationally to Michigan as well, which has been interesting to watch. But right now, I don't have a firm number for you, but God knows I want it too. That was our number one question over and over in the months of reporting for this project.
You mentioned international people. Are we also getting international climate migrants?
Yeah, so the international migration is a new piece that, again, from this 2022 census estimate, We can't fully nail down what the reasons they're coming here, which is obviously my number one question of what brings you to Michigan. I'm sure, if you were in different policy sectors, you'd say it was jobs or it's infrastructure, manufacturing, whatever. So we don't know right now if they're international climate migrants, but we do know that international migration as, a broader category is really leading the migration right now, which is pretty interesting.
And where are people going when they move to Michigan? Where are they choosing to live? What are the hot areas?
I was surprised in talking to those folks. Like I said, we found somebody from the UP to the west side to the east side. So it seemed to be spread out. I will say from the climate science perspective, Ann Arbor and Detroit have been named haven cities. Some of that has to do, though, with areas that can handle growth as part of the climate haven definition, is not only physically and infrastructure wise, but also some of that has to do with political stability as well. I think Ann Arbor has really come out as a green leader. They're a city that has really taken that upon themselves, both in their city and county governments. And then also, they just recently passed a millage to actually get, some skin in the game from the taxpayer. And I'd say Grand Rapids and Traverse City are right behind them in that too. We see there's a reason that Ottawa County is our fastest growing county, far and away from even state numbers. They totally outpace the rest of the state in terms of growth. And I think a lot of that has to do with the proximity to the lakeshore, right? Everyone wants to be on that big lake, but also just, again, the growth opportunity there, the space that's there, the type of living that's there. I would definitely expect those areas to continue growing, that Grand Rapids area, the Traverse City area, and more north. I think people are going to continue to go north as they are looking for space.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about Green Property Management. Not only do they manage everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area, they also manage my entire portfolio. So I can tell you from personal experience that their unique flat fee management style is worth a closer look. If you feel that your property isn't operating to its fullest potential, then Green Property Management can help you take a holistic approach that will save you money, eliminate your headaches, and increase your net income. And if you're a property manager interested in applying Green Property Management's model, give them a call at 1-866-95-GREEN or visit them on the web at greenpropertymgt.com. If you're thinking of leaving your W-2 job and becoming a full-time real estate investor, one of the greatest costs you must consider is healthcare for you and your family. When I made this transition myself, I found the whole healthcare insurance process to be confusing and frustrating. That's why I'm glad I met Chad Creasy at RCB and Associates. Chad is a professional health insurance agent who helps real estate investors and small business owners understand and choose their best healthcare options. And best of all, his services are covered by the insurance company and won't cost you a dime. If you live in Michigan and are expecting a change in your healthcare insurance coverage for any reason, or losing employer coverage or transitioning into Medicare, then you owe it to yourself to contact Chad Creasy at rcbassociatesllc.com.
A large part of your reporting has been asking the question, is Michigan ready for these climate migrants? And spoiler alert, we're not. Talk about that. Why are we not ready to receive this influx of climate migrants?
Let's talk housing first, right? Because I know that's what your listeners are interested in. And so we are still very much in this tight inventory in terms of housing supply. And so when I talked to the Michigan Housing Authority, that was kind of their number one answer. Yes, it's on our radar. We know of the concept of being a climate haven and of climate migration, but we need to house the people that are already here. And so the state already has this 5-year goal of 75,000 new or rehabilitated homes that they're working towards, which Governor Whitmer actually just announced today that there's 17 new projects that are part of that goal that's going to be about 700 units, I think, across the state that will be new or rehabbed. So we're definitely working towards housing everybody. It's a really pretty deep hole we need to dig out of. We really have not had new construction even before the pandemic. So that's kind of number one, is where do we put new people when we already have people that, are in such tight straits right now of if I want to sell my house, where do I go is the question I hear all the time when I'm working on housing projects. So that's number one. Number two is just the infrastructure of everything that comes with that, right? If we're going to build a new housing development, we need to make sure that area has roads and sewer and internet and all the things that go with that. And so Michigan is going to have to make really smart decisions about putting people in spaces that have the infrastructure to maintain them. That's probably going to look like more dense urban areas rather than kind of sprawling people out into rural areas. That would be much more costly. So there's going to be a lot of decisions that need to happen for this to really, be a positive rather than a burden. But I will say that our project raised these questions, and although they didn't have a lot of immediate answers and solutions happening now, there was a lot of conversation about, yes, we need to think smarter, not harder. We need to think efficiency. So I think things are going in an okay direction. I'll be cautiously optimistic that we're not ready today at January 23, but I think we could be ready soon.
You also report on other housing issues in Michigan, and this is a real estate investing show. What would you say to those who own rental property or are investing in rentals here in Michigan, or rentals, housing, whatever type of housing is available in Michigan? Is there any advice you would have for us as investors?
Well, so something that actually was kind of like on the cutting room floor of our project was that investment piece, because climate and real estate investors seem to really be entangled more and more, where that's becoming part of the investment question, especially on the commercial side of things of, will this be a long-term investment, i.e., is this going to get washed away or burnt down because of a natural disaster? And so I think for residential, that question should be asked for the same reason. And same with all of those infrastructure, concerns I just brought up of, if I'm going to invest in a rental property or a residential property, what does the surrounding area look like in terms of how can it grow? Will it grow outward? Will it grow up? Is there opportunity for those two things? What is the city council doing about those, kind of issues now? Specifically, like on the West Michigan side of things, Ottawa County has a really stellar team, really digging into groundwater issues, that they already know that they're growing faster than what they can supply in groundwater, which is ironic being next to the lake. But as people go into these rural areas, they need to have the infrastructure to get them water. So if you're somebody that's looking to invest in Ottawa County, I would consider that. I would consider how far out you're going to go, because if you're going to need a private well, that might be a problem in a couple of years, because we're digging too deep into the ground already, and it's going to get, the quantity and quality of water is going to suffer as more people have private wells in that area. And similarly, in like a hotspot like Traverse City, Petoskey, those cities have to think really critically about building denser for the same reasons. And so I think if you're an investor, I don't know, a lot of my advice is always look at what your city council agenda is, or your county council agenda, because that is going to affect you, obviously. But I think these properties are going to be, I hate to say it's a good, bad investment. That's totally out of my scope, but there's certainly going to be demand. I don't see demand going anywhere right now. So I don't think anyone should be scared away from investing in Michigan right now based on this reporting.
You're certainly bringing up some really interesting issues that investors need to put into their due diligence. What if they are on a well? Is that groundwater still going to be there in the next 5 to 10 years? That is an excellent question. Do you have advice for the local municipalities, the government, the elected officials or non-elected officials who are making decisions that would help them prepare for the climate migrants and the growth in population? And I'll give you an example, because I was just talking with someone in Traverse City who owns some land, wants to build up, but they have a 4-story height limit there. Like, you can't build up over 4 stories. At least this is what I was told. That seems to me to be a problem. Is that something that you would consider a problem? And what kind of advice would you share with municipalities to start thinking differently about this?
The height restriction is a perfect example. It's something that got brought up multiple times in reporting too, especially talking with, realtors and investors in Traverse City. It's kind of something they're frustrated by, because on one hand, I understand the aesthetic appeal of that, of keeping things small town feel, but the reality, the population increase and the environmental reality is that will create urban sprawl. And so, yeah, I do think building up is going to be a solution. Not just that Lindsay Moore, think that, but that was something that was brought up multiple times from my sources in real estate, that is going to be a solution for us, certainly. I also think Michigan has gotten good at adaptive housing, of taking these kind of old warehouses and turning them into a bunch of rental properties. And not only, again, aesthetics seems to be really popular, but it's just from both the environmental and economic perspective, it works. I had someone in the Portage city city manager, had this great idea and just was looking around and said, what we have a lot of is retail glut, honestly. We just have all of this retail commercial space. I'm thinking malls. I myself was a mall baby. I spent a lot of time there, but I'm not spending a lot of time there anymore. So your empty Sears has all those things I mentioned before, has the roads and water and sewage and internet and electricity connection already there. Let's make it housing. So things like that, I think municipalities need to get flexible and get creative. My other word of advice, if I was in the advice giving business, which I am not, but what I would say would be to take advantage of all of these federal dollars coming in. I would just had the opportunity to cover Kamala Harris's visit in Ann Arbor about climate change solutions. And she obviously was touting quite a bit of, the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan legislator that they have really been pushing about all these federal dollars coming in, all the stimulus money. And there's a lot of that sitting on the table. There's a lot to get a piece of for all these local governments. So I think it needs to be really specific and intentional. And it seems to be, at least the Biden-Harris administration is setting it up on purpose that, if you are someone that is building in an area that has been disadvantaged in some way, or if you're, a company that's going to pay a living wage, all these things get you tax breaks, right? And so I think the same could be said for real estate, that if you're going to build in a certain area where you're seeing other people getting these tax advantages, get a piece of that pie.
What should I be asking you that I'm not asking you? Because this is such a wide, broad topic, and I feel like you've done a great job of explaining everything. But I also feel like I'm doing a poor job of asking you everything I should. So what should I be asking you?
I think piece of this, especially I guess if we're going to talk real estate, is really how do we pick and choose the areas that we're investing in? And so we talked about this a little bit, as I've mentioned, with the urban sprawl piece, but also some of that is the green space, right? Like part of why people are coming to Michigan, when I asked these climate migrants, water was number one, but wilderness and like wildlife and green space was number two. And so it really is striking this balance of like urban density, but having, even if it's, the tree-lined streets or, like Grand Rapids has done a really great job of trying to implement more green spaces within a city to keep it growing, but like for environmental reasons as well of offsetting carbon as well. And so things of that nature have to get, as you said, like all the due diligence of a retail investor, where you don't, this generation especially doesn't want to be in kind of a gray urban, skyscraper type of feel. I think that, yes, we need to build up, but we can still have parks and we can still have everything that makes Michigan beautiful. We have to keep that part intact. I think that was the part people got very nervous when we published this project. I had a lot of Twitter DMs and emails that said, shh, don't spill the secret. We don't want people to come here. We love how much space we have. We love our lifestyle in Michigan. We don't want it overcrowded. So I think that's the piece that we're still figuring out, the balance. How do we get it where everybody can come here and we can plan for them, but it won't be oversaturated?
What are some of the reactions that you've gotten from this series?
Certainly that, like I mentioned, stop telling people. I had people, even my own friends, that were like, what are you doing? I'm trying to move back in a couple of years. You're spilling the beans. A lot of people were curious about the population, especially because the 2020 census, we lost a congressional seat over it. So there was a lot of like critical thought against that of like, what does that mean? Like, how can you say that people are coming when we've been losing people for so long? And I say that that's going to be a trickle. It's going to be something slow, that it's happening now, but it's not going to happen in, one huge influx of people storming through, right? Similarly, a lot of people were really, really concerned and interested in the equity piece of this. Like I mentioned, when this whole project started, Sheri and I were really having this conversation about how does Michigan not become a playground for the wealthy then? If it's just the people that can move here, who can afford to move here, what happens? Do we box out anyone that's middle or low income, or people that are already here for that matter? And that's a piece that we're digging into a lot this year, of that equity piece of keeping people here in the state, affordably, and also making sure that it's not all of these West Coast salaries that are going to outbid you in the real estate market, because we already saw a lot of that, especially in like some of these hotspots in northern Michigan, all these cash bids. I talked to several people who have been looking for years and are getting bid out of their hometown. So I think that's going to continue to be a very real problem that I don't have an immediate solution for, but something I'll be reporting on for a while.
Was in your reporting that hasn't made it into the publicly read reports that you've been putting out?
I think something I'm very interested in, aside from, like I said, a lot of those equity pieces, is the commercial side of things. I think it's really interesting to me that climate change is already part of, like a portfolio, for example, or like climate risk specifically. We're seeing that really play out in Florida and California, and I think that that's going to become, I'm hoping that then kind of shifts this focus inward to the Midwest and to Michigan to say, okay, well, this is a better investment. It was something that was like touched upon in my interviews, especially with, city managers and that sort of thing, where they're talking about when we tried to have XYZ company start a new plant here, they were thinking that. They were saying, okay, what's the longevity of having it here in Michigan versus having it in, name your state with its natural disaster happening. So I think that's an interesting piece to things that we'll see more and more of as it plays out.
Did you, in your reporting, see instances of like insurance companies not wanting to insure in certain areas, loans not being able to be acquired in certain areas because of what the conditions are?
Yeah, so I've just kind of scratched the surface of that, but that's exactly kind of the questions that I'm interested in answering of, we hear those horror stories of, like no flood insurance or, even we see it on Michigan's lakeshore for sure of people's, $1 million properties kind of slowly sinking into the lake. And so then, emphasize that if you're on an ocean front. And so that's something that I really have more questions than answers on at this point. But I think it's a worthwhile question if you yourself are an investor of, okay, what's kind of the projection of this area? Because obviously real estate starts with land. So what's your land going to look like in 10 years?
What's your personal outlook? You live in Michigan. You've got this glamorous job as a reporter and I don't know what your lifestyle is like, but do you plan on staying in Michigan? How does this affect your choice to stay in Michigan or live somewhere else?
Yeah, it's funny you should ask this. I do feel like this project really reinforced that I should stay in Michigan. I'm a millennial, I'll out myself. So I am not a homeowner yet either. I'm a renter still. And so I've been kind of bopping around the whole state and the country. And I always thought, oh, maybe I would live out west for a little bit and then come home. But this project really made me reconsider that. I'm like, well, maybe I need to buy something immediately and hang tight to it, because apparently it's going to be an even hotter market than it is right now, all this competition coming in. So my perspective has changed a little bit on, maybe it's not worth moving out. Maybe I got, happened to be right here in the sweet spot. And it's also honestly given me a lot of gratitude of like, wow, of all the places to land, I got really lucky to be born and raised in Michigan. I had really been taking this for granted about how good we have it here.
How would our listeners find out more about you and get access or be able to read the reporting that you and Sheri have been doing on climate migrants?
Yeah, so you can find us at MLive.com. That's where all of our stories are published, as well as we have 7 local papers. So you might see it in print version as well across the state. We have a long list of stories we want to tackle. And so if this is something you're interested in as a listener, we are very interested in hearing from you. Honestly, a lot of our ideas came from the feedback we got after we published this first project in December. So like I mentioned, we have a Climate Haven tag on MLive.com. And then Sheri and I both are pretty active on Twitter if you want to find us there. My Twitter handle is _ Lindsay Moore. So I'm always open to kind of chatting with folks there and getting ideas. So this is not something that is going away for us at all. We think that there's a lot of areas to explore. And we've had some really interesting conversations with fellow Michiganders that have had different perspectives. And it's honestly really helped the reporting. So we're always open for the dialogue.
Can you give us a preview of any upcoming reporting you're doing on this topic?
Sure. So, some of what we wanted to dig into that we didn't quite hit on today, honestly, because I don't have all the answers yet, but a big question we had was, who owns the Great Lakes? And I think that alone could be a couple stories to really explain it to folks. There is a Great Lakes Alliance. It's a binational alliance. So all the states here in the US that touch it, as well as Canada. But it's something that we really want to explain to people because again, there's so much talk around these 5 Great Lakes about how they make us a climate haven. But as we see these droughts in Arizona and Nevada, there has been this increased talk again about, oh, people are going to steal our water. And so we would really like to dig into that and debunk a little bit of that for folks.
And you mentioned there are people who have contacted you with differing viewpoints on this. What would those differing viewpoints be?
Some of them are more aggressive than others, which is always the case in my inbox. You joke that I have a glamorous job, and sometimes it is not always glamorous, but a lot of them, as expected, were folks that just are not really on board with climate change as an entire concept, that is just not something they believe in. So that was kind of like the base level that we expected people to immediately not want to read this for that reason. Similarly, a lot of folks kind of pushed against this idea that like people would come here and not somewhere else. Again, we really had to do a lot of reporting to prove that point because we knew that that was going to be the case. And I feel like we did. We feel like we proved that point in what we could with the information that we had. In terms of other differing viewpoints, and again, a lot of them were just like these questions on how do we make this accessible for everyone then? I got accused a lot to say that I was somehow benefiting from this. I don't know, that I'm pushing this narrative for my own personal benefit, which is comical to me because, like I said, I'm a renter. So if anything, I'm upping my own competition for my home buying. So I'll assure all the listeners there is no monetary benefit for me doing this. It's just something I think is interesting. So yeah, so a lot of people, I guess that would be the differing viewpoint, that they're like, why are you pushing this? And I was like, there's nothing that I get out of this.
I mean, it boggles my mind that you can look in the news, whatever source of news you have, and see that California is getting like 3 years of rain within the past week. Extreme flooding. I mean, these are just articles I've read in the past week. I mean, the Great Salt Lake is dried up. I think it's like only 2/3 of it is left. You're seeing extreme drought situations all throughout the West there. The hurricane. I mean, how can you look at that and not say there's something going on with the climate and that's going to have an effect? It obviously is going to have an effect, whether you believe in climate change or not. So that's my soapbox there.
I hear you. And honestly, that was a lot of what we heard from sources too. We talked to people across the state. So there are political differences in all these different pockets. But they were so I'll take the southeast part of the state as an example. They have a 7-county government entity that has been really focused on urban flooding. As you know, like Detroit roads have got this reputation now, and other places as well. So within those 7 counties, that they really had a variance of political ideas, including climate activists and climate deniers. And what they found, though, that the common ground they could at least meet was, well, we have to do something because we are seeing, like you said, crazy rainfall that we are not prepared for, and that we're drastically underfunded for. And they're also saying we really need people to come back to this area. So if we're going to invest in it, I don't care what you call it, we need to invest in the infrastructure, whether or not you want to call it green or not. So I'm with you that it feels. If you're someone that's watching the news, it feels undeniable. And that, throughout the reporting, we're like, how do we drive that home without scaring people away? There were several times in our editing process that I was like, this feels like a chunk of bad news. We got to separate this out. This is a whole graph, a bullet point of bad things that have happened. But sometimes that's what climate change reporting is, to be honest, is seeing all these examples from Florida to California to Arizona, as you just mentioned. And it's a lot is happening right now that we have to plan for, and it's undeniable in a lot of cases.
Maybe people are just turned off by the term climate change. Maybe we should just call it acts of God.
I do think it's a little bit of a branding issue. And that was something, we really tried to tackle with, if we wanted to attach climate haven, that's a science term. That's not something we came up with, but we're like, we don't want to oversell it. You can't outrun climate change. That's just the reality of it. But I think Michigan as a climate winner is a great branding for someone up here in Michigan to really latch onto as well.
Let's end on that note. Michigan is a climate haven. People do want to live here, will be moving here. There's a lot of positive growth, but we do need to prepare for it. And Lindsay, thanks for coming on the show today and sharing your stories with us and your research. You've done an excellent job with the reports that you've done. And I've really enjoyed reading them. I'm going to continue enjoying reading what you have coming up. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us today.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so appreciative that other people are interested in this. Like I said, this is an ongoing conversation, so I appreciate it.
I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. I'm your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group, and you can find out more about me by going to higinvestor.com. That's higinvestor.com. And you can also ask questions and join us on Facebook by going to RPOA, Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast. This episode was sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com. And RCB & Associates, helping real estate investors and small business owners navigate the complex world of health insurance and Medicare benefits at rcbassociatesllc.com.
You've been listening to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association. You can find out more at rpoaonline.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and review.